Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to do a deep dive into this pretty substantial report on the U.S. government's response to the pandemic.
Over 500 pages.
Yeah, 500 pages, a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
But it's really fascinating stuff.
It is.
What we're going to do is compare what this report says to what was in that proximal origin paper. You know, the one that a lot of people took as like the definitive answer to how this whole pandemic started.
Right.
And you might be surprised at what we find here, especially if you're already pretty familiar with the whole proximal origin narrative.
Yeah, this report covers a lot of ground. The origins of the virus, economic fallout, those vaccine mandates, you name it, it's probably in here. But one of the things that really jumps out is how this report directly challenges some of the key points from that proximal origin paper.
Okay, so let's start there then. What are some of the specific contradictions?
Well, you remember how the proximal origin paper argued that the virus likely jumped from animals to humans naturally? And a big piece of evidence they used for that was the presence of what's called a furin cleavage site in the virus.
Yeah.
And they basically said that scientists would eventually find a similar furin cleavage site in a related coronavirus.
Yeah.
And that would, kind of prove this natural origin theory.
Right. I remember that. That was everywhere.
Well, the thing is, this 500-page report says that despite years of searching, nobody has found that kind of furin cleavage site in any related coronaviruses.
Whoa.
Specifically in sarbecoviruses, which is the family that COVID-19 belongs to.
So it's like the foundation of their argument is kind of shaky.
Yeah, it casts some serious doubt on that whole line of reasoning. And then there's another layer to this.
Okay.
The report also reveals that some of the scientists who were actually involved in putting together the proximal origin paper even acknowledge that it's possible to, manipulate a coronavirus in a lab.
What?
To create a furin cleavage site.
Wait, so they knew that this key feature of the virus could, potentially be engineered, but they were still putting out this natural origin theory as the most likely explanation.
Yeah, that's what this report suggests. And, it brings up some important questions.
Yeah, it does.
About why that possibility wasn't explored more, back in the initial investigation.
Makes you wonder if there were other factors at play. Maybe even some political pressure to downplay certain theories.
Yeah, and that's something this report definitely digs into. They bring up the February 1st, 2020 conference call. The one where scientists like Dr. Fauci were discussing the origins of the virus.
Oh, yeah, I remember hearing about that. That was supposed to be, top secret.
It was. And the report cites emails from that time that show some scientists were really worried about downplaying the lab leak theory publicly, specifically to avoid, damaging China's reputation.
So even back then, there were concerns that political stuff might be, overshadowing the actual scientific inquiry. It's kind of chilling to see that in black and white.
It makes you think, doesn't it, about the extent to which those concerns might have actually influenced the direction of the investigation.
It does. And, speaking of potential conflicts of interest, the report points out something pretty shocking about Dr. Peter Daszak. He was involved in funding research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, but he was also the only American scientist on that WHO team that was supposed to be investigating the origins of the virus.
That's right. And his organization, EcoHealth Alliance, actually had their funding suspended for a bit because of concerns about the Wuhan lab's, lack of transparency and potential safety issues.
Right.
But then, get this, the grant was later reinstated.
It seems like someone was really determined to keep that research going no matter what the risks were.
There's definitely a lot to unpack there. And this report, it just keeps pulling on the threads.
Well, let's keep pulling. What else does this report bring to light that maybe should have come out sooner?
It's crazy how much stuff in this report was once, dismissed as conspiracy theories.
I know, right?
For example, remember all that talk about the proximal origin paper? How it was the foundation for that whole natural origins theory?
Yeah, it seemed like everyone was just taking it as, the final word on the whole thing.
Well, this report, it gives us some really interesting background info about how that paper even came to be.
Okay.
Apparently, it was actually rejected by Nature Medicine at first.
What?
Yeah, before it was finally published.
Oh.
And get this, an anonymous whistleblower actually claimed that one of the reasons it was rejected was because of plagiarism.
Wait, plagiarism? Seriously?
Yeah, I'm serious. The whistleblower said that the proximal origin paper basically just copied arguments from some of the scientists who were on that February 1st conference call.
The one we were talking about earlier?
Yep, that's the one.
So this paper that was supposed to be like the big explanation for how the pandemic started might have been plagiarized.
It adds another layer of crazy to this whole story.
It really does.
Yeah.
So how did the authors of the paper respond to all that?
They drafted a response to the journalist who got the whistleblower's email.
Okay.
But before they sent it, they forwarded the draft to Dr. Fauci and Dr. Farrar to get their approval.
So they were like running their defense strategy by the very people who were potentially implicated in this whole thing.
It definitely raises some questions about transparency
Yeah.
and, potential attempts to control the narrative.
Yeah, it really does.
And there's another interesting detail.
Okay.
In their email, they said they were worried about even confirming that February 1st call ever took place.
That seems strange.
Right. Why wouldn't they want to confirm a real event?
It did happen, right? Like it wasn't made up or
Yeah,
anything.
it was real. But they seemed hesitant to talk about it publicly. Almost like they were trying to keep certain parts of those early discussions about the origins of COVID under wraps.
Like a cover-up almost.
It starts to feel that way, doesn't it?
It does. And this whole thing with Dr. Daszak and his connections to that Wuhan lab just makes it even more suspicious.
You're right. The report really digs into those potential conflicts of interest with his role in that WHO investigation. Remember, his organization, EcoHealth Alliance, was funneling U.S. government grants to the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Yeah, and that funding was temporarily stopped because of those concerns about safety practices at the lab.
And their lack of transparency.
Exactly. But then the grant was just reinstated.
Yeah, despite all those red flags.
It's like, why would they do that? It seems incredibly irresponsible to keep sending money to a lab that was already under so much scrutiny.
Well, one reason they gave was that EcoHealth Alliance supposedly had access to these, crucial virus samples
Okay.
and genetic sequences that the government had already paid to collect.
So they basically rewarded an organization that was already under suspicion with even more taxpayer money.
It does seem that way. And what's even more wild is that the NIAI, which is the part of the NIH headed up by Dr. Fauci, never actually checked if EcoHealth Alliance actually had access to those samples.
Seriously.
Yeah, they just took Dr. Daszak's word for it.
That seems like a huge oversight, especially considering the potential risks involved.
It makes you wonder about the level of accountability and oversight within NIAID.
Yeah, it really does. And to make matters even worse, the Wuhan lab that EcoHealth Alliance was depending on for those samples ended up being debarred by the U.S. government.
Yeah, 10 years.
So barred, what does that even mean? Like, what did they do?
It means they were banned from receiving federal funding for 10 years.
Wow.
Because they refused to hand over lab notebooks and other raw data that the NIH had asked for.
Oh, wow. So we've got this, tangled web of funding going from the U.S. government to EcoHealth Alliance and then to this Wuhan lab that ends up being debarred for basically being shady.
Right.
And all this is happening while the whole world's trying to figure out where this pandemic even came from.
It really is mind-boggling.
It is. And this report, it doesn't stop there. It also looks at the government's response in other areas, like the economic fallout.
Oh, yeah. That was massive. Businesses shut down, people losing their jobs left and right.
Millions of people. And the government spent, trillions of dollars in relief funds.
Yeah, and the report shines a light on some potential misuse of those funds.
Misuse.
Yeah, and fraud. It says billions of dollars could have been lost to people who shouldn't have gotten it, both here in the U.S. and internationally.
So while people were struggling to, pay their rent and buy groceries, there were others who were taking advantage of the situation to get rich.
That's what the report suggests. It also talks about how weak oversight and verification processes in those government agencies made it even easier to happen.
It's infuriating to think that so much money was just, wasted while so many people were hurting.
Yeah, it really raises questions about how effective and accountable the government spending was during the pandemic. And it wasn't just about financial mismanagement. The report also talks about the impact of lockdowns and other measures.
Oh, yeah, those were rough. Businesses closed. Schools shut down. It felt like everyone was basically stuck at home.
The report acknowledges that these measures, although they were meant to slow the virus down, had pretty serious consequences for the economy, education, and even people's mental health.
Absolutely. People lost their jobs, kids fell behind in school, and being isolated from everyone, it really took its toll.
It was a tough time.
This report is a real eye-opener. It seems like we went into this pandemic hoping that our leaders would, be honest and follow the science. But it looks like that wasn't always the case.
It's a reminder that we can't just blindly trust anyone. We have to be critical thinkers, question everything, and hold those in power accountable.
After going through all of this, what are the big things we should be taking away from it?
Well, I think the report shows pretty clearly that the government was more focused on controlling the story than they were on following the science. We see evidence of potential conflicts of interest, silencing dissenting voices, and even a disregard for natural immunity.
It's pretty discouraging. It feels like they pushed these vaccines hard but weren't ready to deal with what might happen if people had problems because of them.
It reminds us that new medical treatments, even if they're well-intentioned, always have risks, and we need to have systems in place to keep track of those risks and help those who are harmed.
It's just wild to me how much of what was called, like, conspiracy theory is now basically being presented as fact in this report.
It really makes you wonder who you can trust these days, right?
It does.
And that's one thing this report really gets into, the government's attempts to kind of like shape the whole story around the pandemic.
What do you mean by shape the story exactly?
Well, the report has a lot of examples of government officials, especially from the NIH and CDC, trying to control what the public knew about what was going on. They'd like push certain viewpoints, downplay others, even put pressure on social media companies to censor stuff that didn't fit their message.
It sounds like less about public health and more like a propaganda thing.
Yeah.
Remember how Dr. Fauci would be on TV, saying all this stuff about masks and vaccines and social distancing,
Yeah.
and then all of a sudden those things would become policy.
Right, and the report says a lot of those statements weren't actually based on solid science at the time.
So they were making these policies based on
Yeah.
like their own opinions, not actual data.
Seems that way sometimes. They were very focused on controlling the message. The report even includes emails showing Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins, along with some other officials, working to discredit and silence scientists who questioned things like lockdowns, the mask mandates, or how safe the vaccines really were.
So anyone who didn't agree with them was basically a target, like what they did with the Great Barrington Declaration.
Exactly.
Signed by a bunch of really respected scientists and doctors. They just labeled it as dangerous and fringe science.
It was a way to shut down any real debate, make anyone who disagreed look like they were against science.
It's pretty effective when you think about it. If you can make your opponent look like some kind of extremist, you don't have to actually deal with their arguments, right?
Right.
And this report shows how that tactic was used to silence people and control what everyone thought. They even pressured social media companies like Facebook and Twitter to censor information they didn't like.
Yeah.
Wait, the government was actually involved in censoring conversations online about the pandemic.
It looked that way. The report says that kind of pressure from the government probably influenced what people saw online.
So instead of open and honest discussions, we were all just being fed a very specific version of what was happening.
It's definitely concerning. The report says this kind of manipulation had a big impact on whether people trusted scientific institutions.
Well, yeah, how are we supposed to trust experts when it seems like they're more worried about saving face and pushing their own agenda than actually doing good science?
It's a huge blow to trust, and the report warns that this could have long-term effects, especially when it comes to facing future pandemics.
How so?
Well, if people don't trust public health officials, they're not going to listen to them, even if the advice is based on good science.
It's pretty disheartening. We went into this whole pandemic hoping that our leaders would, be transparent and guide us using good science. But this report makes it seem like that didn't always happen.
It's definitely a wake-up call for all of us. We need to be more critical, ask questions, and hold those in power accountable for their actions.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener. It's clear that we need to have some serious conversations about how to rebuild trust in our institutions and, how to prevent something like this from happening all over again.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
that conversation needs to happen everywhere, not just in government, but in our communities too. We have to learn from the mistakes that were made and figure out a more transparent, accountable, and, truly evidence-based approach to public health.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today. Thanks for listening to this deep dive. It's been a heavy topic, but it's one we can't ignore.
I agree.
We need to stay informed, keep asking questions, and demand transparency. And most importantly, we need to work together to create a better, more informed future. Thanks again for listening.